Good morning, everyone. Oh, that is way too loud. All right, good morning, everyone. We are going to continue our study of spiritual growth this morning. I looked at the lessons from last week when Paul was here, and then this week, and I was debating whether or not to try to combine two lessons or go back and pick it up. Unfortunately, I think the best course of action, we're just going to kind of skip the lesson that we had intended for last week, which now I'm trying to remember what it was, and I'm drawing a complete blank. Oh, facing the facts. It spoke a lot to what we discussed during our first lesson in that that introspective, that self-reflection, being able to, as a church and as a church member, for lack of a better term, really honestly and authentically evaluate yourself and ourselves, yourself individually, ourselves collectively, to decide what course of action needs to take place in order for spiritual growth to be pursued. One thing that it really hit hard on is being diligent about that type of self-reflection and not just resting on our laurels because it's comfortable. That's an interesting, I guess, an interesting dynamic given the nature of Hub City. We've talked about this a lot. In the beginning, and I wasn't even here in the very beginning, but I was here pretty close to that. It was one of those, like, we were scrambling to make this thing work, right? And everybody had something to do, because if they didn't do their something, then Hub City would not function. That's what happens when you have like a third of the people that we have now. The necessity and the urgency as far as workload, if you want to put it that way, it demanded a lot from everyone. Now we've grown, and something that I think you'll notice over the past, maybe 2 or 3 years is that we've gotten to this self-sufficient sort of resting plane, and I'm not saying that this is what we have done, but in that type of situation, it really is easy to just kind of let the machine run itself a little bit. Facing the facts, the lesson we would have talked about last week, really challenges against that and says, even if things are going well, even if the functionality of a local body is operating smoothly, we still need to be thinking about what's on the horizon. All right, we always want more. We always want more bodies in the building. We want more people in the seats, and that's really important. But at the same time, are we thinking about what our spiritual goals are for the next year or 5 years or 10 years? What do we want Hub City as a church to look like compared to what it is now? And that's what that lesson was designed to communicate. This morning, we're going to talk about how that works and what that might look like from a more pragmatic standpoint as we look at the themes of responsibility and accountability. So I want to start, I was preparing for this lesson and I came across this story. I have no idea if it's true. I figure most preacher stories are not true, but they could be, right? So we'll just, take it for what. And the story goes that 7 years ago, there was a congregation that did not have a full-time preacher. So they had different speakers from the area, come and speak each Sunday. And one Sunday they asked a young man to come preach. And he was just getting started presenting lessons. He had spoken several times. We call it circuit preaching, where you just kind of bounce around and, preach from one congregation to another just to get practice. He had been doing that for a couple of years, but he was still kind of getting his feet wet into what the duties of a part-time preacher were, and it seemed that the congregation had a different view of that. Sometimes he would show up someplace, or he would schedule to go someplace, and they would say, yeah, we wanted you to teach Bible class too. And sometimes up a congregation and they'd say, no, we don't want you to teach Bible class. So it was really just kind of a grab bag. Each Sunday was something different. So on this Sunday, the young preacher and his wife, they show up to the building about a half hour early. That was kind of what they typically did. And they waited, and about 10 minutes before services, this member rolls up into the parking lot, but this member didn't have a key to open the door. So about 5 later, another member, the second one to show up, this is 5 minutes before Bible class is supposed to start. This person had a key, so all three, or I guess all four of them go in. And the preacher was a little bit nervous because the first two members who arrived were women, and he understood that he was not supposed to teach Bible class this particular morning. So in the few minutes, and I'm sure any respectable member of the Church of Christ can understand this, in the 5 minutes between Bible class, before Bible class starts and Bible class starting, 40 members just roll into the building and kind of get settled because class was supposed to start at 10. About 5 minutes after 10, the crowd is getting into their pews and everyone gets quiet. But none of the men go up to the front to teach class, and the young preacher starts to get really nervous, especially when about 10:15 rolls around, because he's thinking, oh my goodness, was I supposed to teach class? Up, he goes to one of the members and he says, hey, did I make a mistake? Am I supposed to teach? Am I not supposed to teach? And the older member of the church says, no, we don't start until Miss Susan rings the bell. And she's not here. Wait till it's here. Her family is well for Bible class ever since the building was built 60 years ago. Just be patient. So when Susan gets here, we'll get started. The young, obviously a little bit, he sat there in silence, and finally at 10:25, he was startled by the ringing, this loud bell ringing. Apparently, Susan up and rang the bell. 10:25 goes for about 20 minutes, and then that was that. It was Susan's responsibility to ring the bell, and there was no way Bible class was going to start until she showed to do that. What's wrong with this picture? Other than the fact that Susan needs a new alarm clock. What does that say regarding responsibility and accountability?
Seems like nobody was willing to step up.
Right. Susan does this, and if Susan ain't here, we're not getting started. What else?
Well, they're relying on the person instead of relying on what they should rely on.
Okay. Well, what time does the Word of God tell us to ring the Bible class?
9:30.
Well played. Well played. Yeah, this isn't a scriptural issue. I don't think this is a doctrinal issue, but it is certainly a functionality issue. Sarah, go ahead.
So one thing that we, a term that we in the military is a failure. And so if you have one person that does everything, and they're not there, then that's a single point of failure. Or pieces of equipment that everything runs through, and for some reason we cannot.
Yeah.
As a single point of failure. So you have redundancy, and they should.
Maybe it's two people to ring the bell. I mean, I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. And Rodney, you're not too far off because you're right. As far as, as looking at how we use our time, really the best use of the time when the saints are gathered on the Lord's Day, to just sit there and stare at each other for 20 minutes while we're waiting on Susan to show up and ring the bell. The trouble is that, as was already pointed out, no one in the congregation really took on the responsibility or the accountability to start Bible class time when Susan unaccountable. She was that single point of failure. You're going to really like today's lesson. I can already tell because that's going to come up a lot. All right, so let's talk about in 15 and 18. You look at the study of, or you read the story of David and Goliath, and you walk back a little bit. King Saul, important character in that event. See, Saul had the responsibility as God anointed, as king. Saul had the responsibility to lead the army of Israel and stand up for God's cause. Remember David's question, is there not a cause? That weeks ago. That was his primary motivation. It didn't matter if it was tiny, Goliath was huge. It didn't matter that the armor didn't fit. It didn't matter that he didn't have any military training. What mattered to David was that there was a cause. It doesn't matter. The logistics do not matter if the cause is great enough. And when you have a circumcised Philistine who is profaning and mocking the armies of God, David said that cause is big enough that I, unqualified, untrained, am going to step into this space and take action because I'm appropriate to do so, but because the cause demands it. Now we look at that from the perspective of responsibility and accountability. It was Saul who was responsible, but he did not want accountability of facing Goliath. He was scared. So we have David, a younger person, who takes on the responsibility as well as the accountability to rid the army of Israel, rid the army of this menace, right? What do we have happen after that? He becomes incredibly jealous of David, plots to kill him, whole, right? I think sometimes that's how it goes, you have someone in the congregation with the responsibility, accountability to perform in the service of God. When that doesn't, and another member steps in to fulfill that responsibility, and maybe that person like held accountable, and then that person can become jealous of another sister who did perform the task. Saul didn't like the results of his lack of accountability. The one who delivered the armies from the Philistines that day. Do you ever feel that? Do you ever find yourself being annoyed at someone in a building because of the way things are done? Even something that perhaps comes from the pulpit. I know in the past, this is something that I've really had to work on, and I'm still not good at it, but I'm trying. So bear with me. I'm going to have a moment of vulnerability and talk about myself a little bit. I struggle, really, really, really struggle with criticism. Even though Chris comes up and says, "Hey, Josh, I want to you," even though I know Chris cares about me, and I don't think any MRI could find a malicious bone in Chris Stoughton's body, and it wouldn't matter if he was as nice and as kind in delivering that. What he's going to say is, "Hey, you might want to work on this." What I'm going to hear because of my own bias is, you're terrible and you're horrible and you should never be allowed, people and stuff like that. I internalize that so deeply that I do my fight or flight response. It starts to kick in, not because I did anything wrong, but because of how I interpret that. See a lot of that maybe in maybe more exaggerated example. I'm happy to say I've never thrown a spear at Chris. Thought about it, never done it. Maybe just a Nerf one. No, not really. I've never considered hurling any sharp objects at anyone in this room. Ask me to come upstairs. So when you look at that in terms of responsibility and accountability, we see how valuable that is, even if it's difficult. I would say especially because it's difficult and uncomfortable. Yes, sir.
What you just said is true. The jealousy, they into the town and they're saying how David had killed.
Saul killed thousands, David killed tens of thousands, or along those lines. So because he was accountable to that, he was responsible. And I think really the overarching thing here. Cain and Abel, we have a similar situation. Cain and Abel held accountable and responsible for offering the sacrifice of God, right? Abel's was accepted, Cain's was not. Very angry, resulted in him killing. A couple of definitions to think about. Listen to this. Responsibility is a duty that one is obligated to fulfill. You're talking about songs, to pitch the songs correctly, to lead the congregation. And those songs, those are all part of the responsibility of the song leader. Accountability is being held liable for the action of responsibility. For example, the song must be service to his responsibility of leading the congregation in the singing of songs that he picked out. He has to be held accountable for that, or he has to be held accountable, but he has to be accountable. You have to have these elements happening right here.
Amazing how thoughtful you have to be when you take on this stuff. And how that draws out the accountability portion of it. But there's a thoughtfulness that goes into it, especially in church organization, because you can hurt someone's feelings. And never is your whole group forward. And so when you start lacking in responsibility, when you start lacking in accountability, your one effort can draw a whole group off in a different direction.
Funny that you mentioned that. Preaching when I was learning how to teach lessons, because you know me, I mean, I'll spew out just words, just fun. I mean, that's how time is just word vomit. And he really encouraged me to watch that. You know, he would always say 10 words if 3 would communicate your point, because he likened preaching to like you're leading people down the path, and you've got all these people that you're trying to keep as your train of thought is concerned. You make one comment or make one that can be interpreted 2 ways. Now you've got people who are following thought, and this people over here are still with you. Well, now you verbally go here, grab these people, bring them back, so everyone is on quote, the same page as what you're communicating. So it's in the same way, the thoughtfulness. You think about what it's like in a church. You know, it starts with a vision or an intent from the eldership, and then that should trickle down. You know, elders having a very clear idea of the direction of communicating to the congregation, then developing for which people can be responsible and accountable in order to catch that forward move. There's a lot of moving parts to it. And, you know, this is again part of the struggle that I had with teaching this class. I'm much more comfortable open up our Bibles at this passage. You know, this, while it might not be as identical as we typically do in class, looking at the pragmatism that is involved. Being the Lord's church, I think, is important. It's proved to be okay so far. I still maintain if it gets too crazy, I'm gonna. Let's talk a little bit about Ezekiel 7. But before that, if you look at 2 Timothy 2, we see Paul tells Timothy, preach the word. He tells him in the passage, be ready at all times to do all of things. Convince, exhort, with all suffering and teaching. He had the responsibility, Paul's advice, to be accountable for preaching. Paul tells to Timothy, here's what you need to do. Timothy goes out and does it. But Timothy has to be accountable to that responsibility. And that's an important part of what we're talking about here. Paul stated, chapter 3, verse 3, that passage, Paul said he were sisters. Paul planted, Apollos watered, then what happens? But God gives the increase, right? Paul says that each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. That's like the lens of responsibility. James chapter 3, verse 1, James says, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. Does that not speak responsibility? Do they just let anyone fly a plane? I mean, hey, look at you. Maybe they do. No, there's a lot of training, right? There's a lot of training. There's a lot of in order to be deemed appropriate. You have a responsibility to do something. That was your job. Right? Your job to be in the air. You were responsible for that. You were also accountable. You had to know how to you can't just run hopes and dreams. a situation like that. All teachers, the same way, account for the reality of teaching, but what does this have to do with Ezekiel? Ezekiel was a priest and a prophet, ministered probably some of the darkest times in Judah's history. It was during the years of the Babylonian captivity. He was the one to be responsible and accountable for delivering the message of God to an exiled people. Sounds like a super job, right? Everybody is always in a good mood. In Ezekiel 2, chapter 2, in chapter 3, there is this conversation God has with Ezekiel, telling him what he should do. Interesting and informative passage that's found in Ezekiel in verse 8. And he says this, "Go," this is God to Ezekiel, "and go get captives to the children of your people and speak and tell them, thus says the Lord God, whether they hear or whether they refuse. Go to them whether they hear or whether they refuse." God basically telling Ezekiel that he is and accountable to speak to the people, regardless if the people listen or not. How many times have you question your actions because of the response of another? Say, "Hey, Landon, today." Landon looks at me and says, "Mind your own business." And I'm thinking, did I just do something wrong? Should I not have done that? Or you invite somebody to come to worship with you, and they say, I'm not going to your church. You think, oh, did I do something wrong? Do something wrong? You hold somebody accountable. Chris, you hold me accountable, and I get offended, or I get feeling, well, I shouldn't do that anymore. What all of the situations start to second guess what God has to do. I mean, God didn't tell me to land in share, but we're operating with some freedom here. Now I'm questioning what God has told me to do based on the response of a person. All right, here's another example. Raise your hand, but I know plenty of people who absolutely refuse if they are at a slide and someone is asking for money to give any money because they are convinced and this big canvas sack of cash and is going to go get in their BMW at some point by the end of the day, just out there swindling the general public. My response to that is, so what? Is your generosity made less by someone's use of it? Absolutely not. Responsibility is not determined by how it is received. How many times have you told your kids, I don't care what the other person does? Or you tell one kid to go apologize to another kid before, dinner Jackson, the water, I'm sorry, and I forgive you. And then they come back and like, I don't know what happened. How many times have we said to our kids, it's okay, you did what you were responsible for. It doesn't matter how it is received, we still have a responsibility. And I will say the huge issue within churches today, and a huge issue within people today, is that we edit how we are and who we are based on how we anticipate it will be received. What do you think? Go. Absolutely.
If you're not comfortable with going to a brother or sister, then you account. And you're not the same way you're receiving accountability. Okay, people sometimes take that offense. Watching me, they're judging that.
Yeah, they are.
Okay with it, because I would rather here in front of the Lord on Judgment Day. I didn't do as I was uncomfortable.
Yeah. When I was a fire several years ago, one of the things that we got trained on was line of duty identifications, which is the worst. And one of the things that our instructor said is, you need to keep yourself together. Yes, this is horrible. And yeah, human being, you are going to be emotionally impacted. I come and I tell you that you passed away, and then I be in such a way that you feel responsible for my emotion. That's just selfish. You know, so when we are uncomfortable in a situation we are doing, comes to me, and I'm sure that's not a common to have with me. If he says that it's something and is difficult for me, a lot for him to make you feel good in that situation. You know, that's almost too much. Or if I go and criticize my kids and really on to them, there are times it would be nice if you would just be convinced that I'm right. But that's a lot to ask. You've wounded someone's pride has been wounded, or someone feels responsible, or that godly sorrow that leads to repentance. Expect that in that moment to make up having the conversation. Really a lot to ask. So you're absolutely right. Comfort is incredibly important. Ezekiel gives us kind of all of this. Ezekiel has this and this scene in the valley of dry bones. We love this passage. It's God asked the question, will some of these bones live? Well, Ezekiel was smart enough to know that only the Lord knew if those bones could live again. So God said, go out and prophesy a valley of bones. And I've always had this like Lion King-esque elephant graveyard image in my head when I think about the valley of dry bones, dark and desolate. And Ezekiel's out there and he starts prophesying these bones. In verse 10, bones, they start to rattle. The text is really cool. It says they all come together, sinew, then muscle, and all of that stuff. The bones end up becoming what's called an exceedingly great army. Now Ezekiel's alone in the valley, and the Lord gave him instructions to, and Ezekiel goes out and he sees God in the presence of a bunch of bones. How many of us would go out the valley of dry bones to them? Ezekiel had the responsibility that he would be accountable for responsibility, but there was no promise that Ezekiel would validate his effort. All right? Like Jonah. I mean, Jonah was sunk, right? To go to the Ninevites to them. And in fact, the Ninevites actually ended up being full in spite of Jonah's efforts. The situation in which the one was almost guaranteed validation. I mean, we talk about our frustrations with I planted, Apollos watered, but gave the increase because we want to see the increase on a silver platter before Jonah, and Jonah wasn't having it, right? But here Ezekiel, no any sort of reaction or validation, action, anything like that. Talk to a bunch of bones, and then look what God made happen as a result. Whereas I'm trying not to be too harsh, but I'm just going to say it. We get way too quickly and way too easily when it comes to our service to God. Yes, I would be a Christian as long as I guarantee some sort of validation, appreciation, or some little scratch on the back for it. But if there's nothing in it for me, I'm really not interested. And I know that there are some of you thinking, well, Josh, that's not really fair. You shouldn't say that. Maybe I'm completely wrong. If you're looking at what we do and live as opposed to what we say when we're in the church, I think maybe I'm a little bit more right than we're comfortable with. Let's back to Ezekiel chapter 3. God makes a nation. Son of these are the whole house of Israel. Indeed, they say, bones are ours and ourselves are. In verse 14, motivating words Ezekiel about the people are recorded. The Lord himself takes on the responsibility to graves the people himself account this in 14 to know spoken it and that he had performed it. We've talked before about how easy it is for congregations to struggle spiritually and it's the 80-20 whatever. The responsibility of doing the work falls on on, maybe just a few people, but what about the dry bones? What about the dry bones? Here's where this is not going to think it's. We give up on people who the church, people who may have it by the wayside, people who faded into the back, maybe a little bit into obscurity. And I would remind you that bones represent those people, and he did give up on them. Ezekiel 7 is an incredible passage that demonstrates God's power, and it certainly demonstrates Ezekiel's faith, but it also demonstrates the value of dry bones. You with me? Know what I'm stepping in? So what does that look like then? Functional. This is stories and good themes. What does it look like at Hub City Church of Christ? And go. Go. Clarion, okay, way different. By true, our responsibility. What else?
Really got recognizing when they take 20, 30, 40, 50 years to accomplish is very difficult.
There is a timeline. One of the kind of a preacher hack, I guess. Any preaching conference I've ever been to, I've heard iterated a new and you want to start something new. What it is, it takes about a year. There are things to be absorbed into the culture. Now we show building Bible classes according to John at 9. We have over at 10. We don't have reminders. We don't have like, what time does Bible class begin? It's part of our culture. But add something else, or something away, or we adjust something a little bit. It really has to be forced. You've got elder, preacher, deacon, don't forget this new thing. Hey, don't forget we got a potluck coming up, or hey, don't forget, we're a study here or a study there. And that patience can be a little bit difficult. You want to like make this start doing before today, and then wonder why kind of fall by the way. So that diligence is certainly an important element of that. Okay, so moving into Acts chapter 11 now, we're at a different scenario here. So Agabus in Antioch, he showed by this that there was going to be famine in Judea. As a result, the disciples individually, according to their they determined to send relief to brethren dwelling there. It's really, really, really special, right? As we would say, that's a very Christian thing to help feed people who don't have food. Sounds beautiful, but the whole pragmatic element to that, right? There are a lot of questions. How is it going to get there? Going to take it? How much food? Oh, how is it going to be distributed? All of these things to just be dealt with. It's not enough to say, I'm willing to send food. Well, great. Gold are for, but unless it actually comes to fruition, you're really not doing anything other than talking. So Barnabas and Saul were in responsibility to deliver the disciples had given to the in Judea. They were also held accountable that the funds arrive in Judea and in proper elders. This is your single point of failure. Is that what? Okay, so we definitely, or we can see that in this example. So each congregation, for lack of a better term, treasurer. The treasurer is responsible for funds of the congregation. That is held accountable for any misappropriation of funds known by the whole congregation, and so when some congregation, and y'all, it has happened, violates or violates the trust that the congregation had in him and misappropriates funds for personal negligent reasons, the whole congregation is going to be affected by that. So Barnabas and Paul had not the goods to the not the goods to the others in Judea. What was the impact? True. Given the circumstances, what else would have been the impact? Yeah. Now, does that take away from the disciples who decided to give? It certainly does not. Will their responsibility for making this available, but then or from there it goes upon the shoulders of Barnabas and Saul, and if Barnabas and Saul mess up, then the whole operation comes, crumbling down like a card. So any member does need his responsibilities and is not accountable. The whole congregation suffers. I feel like I'm uniquely positioned in my profession. But I have a pretty clear view most of the time of the inner workings of a congregation. All right? I would want, like, for Susan. All right? Very common mentality that I show up someone else's